Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Reed, and I'm here to speak to you about how we see the practice of regenerative development and design. And we're very specific about those terms. What does it mean to develop? And then what does it mean to design? And we don't mean the term development but in terms of building development. We mean it in terms of evolutionary development.
Regenerative development, what does that mean? And there are a number of interpretations and practices out there. All of them are good. What we are going to be talking about today is perhaps, from your perspective, a deepening of what it means. And the intention is not to make anybody wrong, but to actually help us see what richness can be added to this term and what actually we need to do to what we feel to be truly regenerative. And just start out with this quote from Gregory Bateson: "The major problems of the world are the result of the difference between the way nature works and the way people think." So what does that mean? And this talk is going to explore how must our thinking and our culture shift. If the nature works differently, that means our thinking must need to be different. So what is our role then if our thinking is different? As architects, as builders, as humans? That's what we hope to be able to quickly address today in these 40 minutes. I'm going to frame this with a whole system dimension that Plato developed. Instead of just material and matter in the universe, Plato came up with the idea of function, being, and will. Otto Scharmer of Theory U uses hand, heart, and mind. Or we might talk about what, how, and why. But these dimensions are, if we only use one of them, we can actually get ourselves in trouble. And so the functional definition is what gets transformed, not just what we're doing, but what is it worth transforming. The being and becoming is how we are engaged. Who do we need to be? How do we need to develop ourselves? And the will is what gives us the motivation to change and to transform. And I think we would all agree that we need to change the way we are doing things. The sustainability movement has been around for 40 to 50 years, or certainly the environmental movement has, and things have only gotten worse. So something is missing, and we're proposing that we need to be more conscious of the whole dimensions, all the dimensions of life, and this is one way to frame it. So function, let's start with that. One way to characterize this is that we're working with life as a whole system, not in fragments. And whole does not mean just gluing a bunch of pieces together and calling it whole, or putting a bunch of sustainable development goals in a circle and saying we have a whole system. Fragments are not whole. And so everything and every being are connected. How do we actually work with that? And so these fragments we speak of is, we often talk about sustainable buildings or environmentally friendly products like sustainable paint. Well, there's no such thing as sustainable paint and no such thing as a sustainable light bulb. There's no such thing as a sustainable building, even though we use those terms, because a building in and of itself is not sustainable. Any physically built object suffers entropy and actually collapses. So they are not living systems. They are actually continually dying, if you will. When we dissect a frog is actually a whole living being. But when we dissect it into its fragments, it's no longer a frog. So fragments in themselves don't help us to understand wholeness. They do help us understand some very important aspects of life, but we cannot work with them in fragments. This is, I think, a major difficulty in the world of the sustainability movement. And this diagram here down in the lower left by Bill Mollison actually shows the level of complexity even just in a small area of land. There's a whole bunch of things going on and they are inextricably connected with each other. How do we actually work with that in a way that doesn't collapse it into a bunch of fragments and pieces? Another aspect of life is that life is nested. All living entities are made up and connected to smaller and larger systems. Each system is offering value to the larger system, and each larger system is actually offering value to the smaller system. There's no real boundary. And that's actually one of the paradoxes of life that we actually have trouble thinking about in our culture, because we're kind of an either or culture. And when we think about wholeness, let's think about my body. My body has skin. I'm bounded by my skin, but in fact, my skin does not really have a boundary. It breathes, it transpirates. I eat, I eliminate, I breathe. So all of that is a continual exchange of nutrients and support to help my body stay alive. If it actually was truly bounded, I would be dead in a second. Or if it was no boundary on my skin, it was totally open, then I'd be a puddle and I'd be equally dead. So this paradox of tension of being bounded and unbounded is very important, and we have to be able to work with both those ideas at the same time. Another dimension: every living function generates value for the whole system. And this is not just about competition, I think, or competition or Darwinian version of evolution, as many people interpret it. Living systems actually cooperate with each other. In general, there's a lot of support going on. Yes, there's death. We all are food for some other system, and that's part of life. But in general, while we're alive, we are actually in a cooperative mode. As we work with this concept of bounded and unbounded and adding value to the next larger system and smaller system, we actually have to have that's unmanageable, right? So we actually need to work with a system that's large enough that we can have tremendous effect, and small enough that we can actually see the effect and manage ourselves, a feedback system, if you will. And we interpret this as a place. Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for economics, proved that the tragedy of the commons, that thought piece by Garrett Hardin in the 1960s, that we will collapse the earth because we can all draw on the commons. I can actually fish as much as I want. I could draw all the fish I want because the fish are free and everybody owns them. And if I have enough fishing equipment, I can destroy the ocean, or we can destroy the air or the watershed, in our countries. So the tragedy of the commons actually is a true concept, and we're actually doing that to the planet now. But when we work in place, we actually can see the results of our impact and respond accordingly. And Ostrom proved that places, when you're actually working at that level of scale, we actually respond and act responsibly. So one of the important aspects of regenerative work is to work with the largest complex system that we can understand and respond to and offer help to. And a kind of lead in advance, a concept in advance, is that we believe that we save the world place by place, that we can't save the world as a whole. It's too abstract, it's too big, it's not one person's responsibility. But if we each manage the place where we live, we can actually, in aggregate, save the planet. So an example of this now, okay, all that sounds very abstract. How does this work? And this is a pretty simple example from early in our career as regenerative practitioners. And we were asked to do a grocery store, a cooperative grocery store, community grocery store in Brattleboro, Vermont in the US. And they called up and they wanted to do a LEED Gold grocery store. And one of the questions that I ask people is, well, that's great that you want to do LEED, but do you also want to do sustainability? And a lot of people are confused about that because they think LEED means you are doing sustainability. And by the way, you're not. You're basically offering solutions, green-oriented solutions that gives us a foundation to lead towards sustainability. But in and of itself, a LEED Gold building is not sustainable. And by the way, this is as a mental example. Imagine 100,000 LEED Platinum Walmarts or big box department stores sprinkled around the planet. Is that going to help us achieve a sustainable condition? And it may help, but in and of itself, 100,000 LEED Platinum Walmarts will destroy the planet. So there's a lot more that we can do. And how do we actually use our building projects, our actions in the community to begin to leverage true sustainability, which requires regeneration? We'll get into that in a minute. So this grocery store, they said, no, we want both. We want to be LEED and we want to do sustainability, which is a perfect answer. And so we did about 5 minutes of research on the food system in the United States, and the average bite of food travels 3,600 miles. And in our first meeting, before we began, it was with the executive committee, we took them through the grocery store just to see where the food came from. And the first bin we came to in the produce section was the apple bin, and the apples were from New Zealand. So that's, I don't know, 12,000 miles, something like that. So we can begin to see how the average bite of food travels 3,600 miles. There were strawberries from California, another 3,000 miles. There were blueberries from Chile, I don't know, what is that, 5,000 miles. So we can begin to see that the energy expended for a food system is incredible. That if we just made efficient refrigeration cases and low toxicant paint in the grocery store and did stormwater management, we would be doing a good thing, but we would not be addressing the real issue. And so we propose that a question: what happens if there's a truckers' strike? And the manager of the store said, well, we're out of business in 2 days, 3 days. And somebody else said, yeah, and if Whole Foods, that's a big supermarket chain in the United States, moves into town, we're probably out of business within a year. So what is the one thing, we asked, that a trucker strike or Whole Foods can't compete with? And the answer was local food. So that gave us a very good insight as to what we really needed to work on, because a sustainable grocery store without food in it isn't a sustainable grocery store. So we looked at, instead of looking at the building, we looked at the food shed. And we found out that all these farms in light green and dark green had been abandoned over the last 50 years. There might have been 2 left over. And of course, in all the other counties, not just this one, it was the same story. And the best soil, and also all the soil in this region was depleted because of over-farming and overgrazing and bad forestry practices. The best soil was in downtown Brattleboro. And somebody said, well, we built in downtown Brattleboro. Well, no, you've only built over 35% of the land. And what if we actually established gardens that all the co-op members would actually be tending in Brattleboro? Well, that was kind of an interesting idea. And so this grocery store was programmed, the brief became to establish a local agriculture extension service to teach people how to grow their own food again, and a cannery so they could can their food, and a daycare center so they could take care of the kids while the parents were doing that work, an abattoir for hunters to dress their meat because it's a big hunting area, a credit union to loan money to small farmers to begin to reestablish farms in this outer area, and a forestry extension service to begin to work with the community to restore the health of the soil in this watershed. Oh, and by the way, a grocery store. So the program of the grocery store changed entirely because of the questions we were asking in terms of the system. We weren't just looking at this store itself, we were looking at the system that it was nested within. And they were so excited, the executive committee was so excited that they rushed us in to do a presentation, and it was a disaster. And as one board member said, all we wanted was a grocery store. What is all this stuff? And we were fired that evening. We realized that we had not worked with a whole enough system. And the whole system required us to be very closely engaged with the major stakeholders and decision makers in that community. And we thought that if we just, offered them good thinking, that would be sufficient. So it taught us a valuable lesson about what it meant to work with wholeness. And we wrote a big report because we felt like we needed to justify and leave a record of our work. And we got a call almost to the date a year later from the president saying, "Bill, we want to apologize. This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to us." And we are now working with other co-ops in the region. We've developed a 100-year ends policy to begin to incorporate these ideas. And that is still an ongoing process now. So despite ourselves, this big idea has been taking hold. And so as Mark Goring said, the building wasn't as important as we thought. And if you will, the building is an acupuncture process to continually regenerate the system. So that gives you an idea. Oh, by the way, one of the things we've learned is that it takes about a year for people to shift paradigms. And it takes about 3 to 5 years for paradigm shifts to be permanent in a culture. So I like to say, it's a little obnoxious perhaps, is that any kind of change management weekend or transformational week, they're wonderful and they're great experiences, but don't expect any permanent results. Because the only way we get permanent results in a culture is to practice, just like to practice a language, to practice music, an instrument, any kind of skill requires an ongoing practice. So sustainability, if you will, regenerative sustainability is hard, and it's a change, and it requires practice to engage in it. So this is not about just delivering a project anymore. This is delivering an ethos and helping people live into that ethos. One of the important principles of living systems, if we can anthropomorphize a living system, is that living systems don't work on problems. They only work with potential. They only look forward into evolutionary potential. The problem with problem solving is that it is like riding into the future facing the past. It may eliminate what we do not want, but it does not help us to focus on what we do want. And that might be an analogy, might be driving a car by looking in the rear view mirror. So if you will, nature is, if a hurricane comes through and destroys an ecosystem, it's going right to work to reestablish itself. No questions, no worry, just working together to achieve a dynamic, healthy system. So the idea of potential is that it's always there. Here, this example is a stream in Baltimore, Maryland, that an engineer had to turn into, that turned into a cement trough because the total suspended solids. It was ripping. The soil was being ripped out because the parking lots to the north were during rain events would rush down the stream because it was not, the water wasn't allowed to be absorbed into the soil, and ripping it apart and sending solids into the Chesapeake Bay. So this was the engineer's solution, was to build a concrete trough. And that made sense because he wasn't allowed to work on the water control to the north of this stream. But 3 years later, the state of Maryland developed some of the first stormwater management laws in the world, and they were then able to control the water coming from the parking lots and buildings to the north, and that allowed them to reestablish the stream. And this is what it looks like after three years later. So we know that nature can recover itself if we work with her. This is not about just fixing problems. This is actually being in a symbiotic relationship with how nature wants to work, and for us to pay attention to that. The Loess Plateau, many of you may know about that. John Lewis recorded this work in China. It took them a long time to actually begin to work with the farmers to figure this out, but it actually only took about 18 months once they started working for this desert system to recover. And look at this during COVID, this COVID-19 period. Here's Beijing, just how fast systems respond when we stop dumping toxicants and stop the damage. Then at the Venetian Canal, you actually see into the bottom. If you've ever been there, you know that they're pretty muddy normally. I'm not suggesting that Venice or Beijing are healthy right now, but you can see how fast nature responds if we work with her. So it's pretty exciting. So life is always working with potential. It evolves, it renews, it develops. And that word develop is really important. It's the synonym for evolution, but it actually is a word that is conscious. When we work with human development or childhood development, we're actually paying attention to what that entity wants to be. And the thing about when you work with the natural system as a whole system, life runs up. Life is the process of becoming. It is not just an entropic system as we have with our man-made elements. So the beautiful thing is life runs up. It doesn't degrade as long as we have the sun. Okay, so those are the functional aspects of working with life. What's the being and becoming aspect? So this actually picks up more on this word development. Life is not static. It is always changing. It is always developing. It can devolve. We can actually destroy life like we're doing now on the planet, or we can actually work with it to increase that potential, that opportunity for recovery. So how do we keep up with change? How do we co-evolve? How do we engage not only ourselves, maybe we might understand this as individuals, how do we engage design teams and communities in order to have an opportunity for massive change? And what mental models do we hold that may prevent us from doing so? This is all part of regenerative development. Oh, by the way, I want to go back. One of the cool things about living systems is that we've seen the first positive change happens within 18 months. And these positive changes happen within literally weeks. But this kind of work was 18 months. I like to say it's not literally true if we actually all understood this, we could save the world in 18 months. That's all it takes. It is not a long drawn out effort. The only thing that gets in the way is our willingness to change, to become. So an example of being and becoming, and I'm not going to spend the time, this is a direct presentation, but you might want to do this at your own time. It's a very simple exercise. Think of a few projects from your experience, a couple that were fulfilling and a couple that were agonizing. And you don't need to be an architect or an engineer or a developer to have a project. Making dinner is a project. Any event with a beginning, a middle, and an end is a project. And if you're working with other people to do those, so a teamwork-based project, think of a couple that were fulfilling and others that were agonizing. And I'm sure we all have those. The question is, what made the difference? What are the core issues that made the difference in that process? So maybe you guys could take a break and do this on this presentation, but let me just share with you some of the responses that we've gotten over the years to that, is that we have never heard technology mentioned as a response. We've only heard money mentioned twice in probably 15 years. But typically it's leadership, it's common purpose, it's alignment around belief systems, it's transparent management, it's care for each other's development. All these answers relate to a being state and a becoming state. And we rarely give them the kind of traction they need in the projects that we work on. So to be conscious of who we need to be and how we need to work together in order to achieve something we may not have thought of before, or objectives or functions that are way beyond what we've ever done before, is extremely important to this work. And a great book I just finished reading by Tyson Yunkaporta out of Australia is Sand Talk. He's Aborigine and PhD professor. The most destructive idea in existence: I am greater than you, you are less than me. This is the source of all human misery. And he goes on to say, all lawbreaking comes from that first evil thought, that original sin of placing yourself above the land or above other people. Katia Laszlo, some of you may know, uh, from Mexico. It says, sustainability is an inside job. Until we are working on who we are unlikely to change the world outside of us. So how do we work on that when we're working on projects? And maybe we'll have some time to actually talk about that, but all we do is we help people be conscious of it, and they can actually self-reflect on who they need to be. So a little mind map of where we are. This conventional design, Randy Croxton, the green architect in New York City, says we design our buildings one step better than breaking the law. Then green design comes along. That's LEED and BREEAM and Living Building Challenge, et cetera. That implies that maybe if 70% energy savings is good, then 0 must be sustainable. And so typically we work in this realm of green and sustainable design. But perfection, 0, is impossible. We can't do it. And in fact, it's a mechanical idea. 0 doesn't even exist in nature. So what do we have to do to, and by the way, this is not saying that this is not important. We do need to slow down the damage. Hunter Lovins likes to say that these kind of programs, LEED, et cetera, give us the time to actually begin to work on the restoration and regeneration. Now that was an old thought. We don't have the time anymore, folks. So we need to be working not only on reducing the damage, limiting energy, limiting carbon to the atmosphere, but then restoring the damage we've caused and then regenerating. And restoration and regeneration are 2 different words, and they mean 2 different things. Right now, many people are using restoration and regeneration as the same thought. They are not. Restoration, let me give you a meaty definition. Restoration means to return an ecological subsystem, like a wetland, a forest, a riparian corridor, a beach dune system, to return an ecological subsystem to a condition where it has the self-organizing capability to evolve. Now, the problem is that system is not isolated from humans. And unless humans understand its role and understand how to perpetuate it, some 10 years later, somebody comes along and says, I need to build a shopping mall or an office building, and says, we can take about half of that wetland. It doesn't really matter because, we'll mitigate it somewhere else. That's the slower way to die. And because we reduce, we compromise around stuff. And compromise is actually, we keep compromising and compromising and compromising, and that is death. So the whole system is that we have to reduce the damage and we have to actually restore and regenerate. That's living systems here, buildings and infrastructure on the left-hand side. This is qualitative thinking, and this is quantitative thinking. And we don't have time to go into this in detail, but I think the picture is pretty obvious. So becoming conscious of our thinking is a practice, thinking and being. And right now, we have a tendency to live in our left hemisphere, in the functional and elemental mind. The holistic and relational mind does not figure into our training and our education. And that is really what part of what this work is about, is actually opening up. What does it mean to think in holism? That's what this talk is introducing. So part of holism is that we are in a continual reciprocal relationship with all of life. It's a continual process of exchange and mutual support. I am no more important than the tree. And I'm sorry to say, you are no more important than the tree. And until we actually understand that we are in this incredibly symbiotic relationship, we will unlikely ever achieve a sustainable condition. And that's the hard truth. So what are people for then? Just not to support life, but it's actually to understand how to engage with life in a creative way. Man seems, Bucky Fuller, this is a typical Bucky Fuller quote, man seems unique as the comprehensive comprehender and coordinator of local universe affairs. Notice he said local universe. That's another way of saying place. And we are responsible, we are the consciousness of the planet, not the unconsciousness. Now, we are waking up to be conscious, and more people are responding to this. What is our unique role? And not everybody has the same role. We all have unique attributes that we offer. Part of our job is to understand how we're integrated and work together and complement one another, and complement the trees and the worms and the soil and the microbes. All of that, all of those aspects are equally important. I love this quote from Cat Anderson in Tending the Wild. We are integral with the whole system of life. California Native peoples believe that when humans are gone from an area long enough, they lose the practical knowledge about correct interaction, and the plants and animals retreat spiritually from the earth or hide from humans. When intimate interaction ceases, the continuity of knowledge passed down through generations is broken, and the land becomes wilderness. We actually, without humans, the healthiest places on the planet have been with indigenous cultures, not all of them, but with indigenous cultures that actually work this way. They created more diversity of relationships and resilience over time because they actually paid attention. They were conscious of all the role of all life in that system. So one other aspect is who I am, how we work together. So it's self-actualization, group actualization in service of system actualization. We have a tendency to actually work on our own personal development, all the self-help books or Tony Robbins or landmark courses. How we work together is kind of organizational development work. What often is missing from those two discussions is how we need who and what we need to serve. And this place, the idea of place. One of the ways to describe place is how big is here? What can we actually know that is part of our community and our watershed? We have all the technologies and knowledge we need to sustain and heal the planet right now. We had them 2,000 years ago. We don't need any more. But what's preventing us from incorporating them? And that, I believe, is will. What's the source of motivation? The potential to actually do so. So the potential actually is a motivating concept. What's my potential to be someone more intelligent, more loving, more caring, more giving? That's the potential I can work towards, and that motivates me to actually be part of a community. How do we actually create meaningful quality of life in the towns we live in? How do we support our neighbors? So one of the great frameworks is the idea that we need to stop working with problems which are dualistic. You could actually see that all life can be seen as an activating force and a restraining force. This is an old Sufi framework. And if we only live with those two forces, those dynamically oppositional forces, we end up compromising. And this is what's happening with politics. It's what's happening with science and religion, heart, mind, quantity, quality. Those kind of dualisms create either or logic. And life doesn't work that way. It's both and. But when we actually only work here, we have a tendency to, I'll give up a little, you give up a little. And that means that both of our egos have been beaten up a little, so we feel comfortable that we've been equally beaten up, and we give up a little. I give up a little on the wetland, you get a little less building, a little less return on investment, and we call it a day. And then 3 years later, we realize, oh, that wetland shouldn't have been destroyed. That's way too important. And so the compromise is that slower way to die. We compromise again, and we drive ourselves into the ground. So it's a word that needs to be excised from the English language. Now in Spanish, it's not exactly the best word. I'm trying to think of the word. Well, it might come to me. So harmonize is what nature does. And when we work on harmonization, we find out that problems actually disappear. Problems dissolve. And one of the ways that we have been hired by many of our clients is because they see that word harmonize and they say, wow, if you can harmonize, that's worth about 15 years worth of lawyers. And so here's an example of that. This is Viña del Mar, Chile, and there were 25 activist groups all against this developer. They all called the developer the enemy. The developer is going to build this 19-hectare site and do a 1.5 million square feet of, no, my goodness, it was 4.5 million square feet of mixed-use office space. And the community was saying developers have destroyed this city. It was one of the great vacation spots in southern South America, Viña del Mar. and the city was dying, and they blamed the developers, so they weren't going to let this development happen. So the developer said, well, if you can harmonize our relationship, let us, that's worth a lot of lawyer time. We'll give you 2 months to show us what you can do. So we went down there. This is the way the city used to be. This is one street in the city now, but the city was one of the great garden cities of the world, borrowed from the English garden city tradition in the late 1800s. But this is what it looks like now. It has been dispirited. The Bay of Valparaiso Bay is a dead zone. The Marga Marga estuary has literally been made into a parking lot. Beautiful buildings have been covered over with cheap facades. So the spirit has left the city. You can feel that it's dying when you drive within the city in about 5 minutes. So we look at not the site, but we look at the whole place out about 20 kilometers. And what we found out is that there was a lot of opportunity to reestablish the healthy watershed, to reestablish the garden city, to reestablish beach erosion issues, to deal with habitat connectivity, to deal with the social issues. And we spent the first 2 weeks there. We actually found out that this place, every time human beings were involved, the actual ecological health improved, which is something we've never seen. And until we got to the late 1980s, 1990s, and everything except for highways and universities started going downhill. When the tourism started going downhill, that's when the community realized we have a problem. But one of the things we helped them see is that this community had also been able to compound resilience over time. They were actually good at innovating succession, but they had lost that ability politically over the last 30 years. So we call this a story of place. What is the story of the evolutionary potential of this place? And within 2 weeks, the results of the first 18 people, 17 or 18 groups we worked with, went from extremely negative to supportive or enthusiastic. Not about the development, but about the willingness to work together with the developer. Now, the developer, that was actually harder because the developer had to stop a transactional relationship. This was the name of the development, Las Salinas. The typical developer is doing a transactional relationship. I'll give you a park, I'll give you a school, we'll give you money if you give us or access to the site, if you give us permission to build our project. That's a very transactional relationship. Most people can relate to that. It's full of compromise. The new relationship is that everyone, all the stakeholders were in service to the health of the larger community and ecosystem. The developer was just another stakeholder. That was very hard for the developer to get his head around. But once they saw, and the community saw, that the developer was willing to actually work with the community in service of something, the potential of health of a dying city, that changed the relationship. And as a result, the project was informed by that new understanding. And so we built a collaborative field, a field of energy. Sounds a little woo-woo, but really what happens, it's no different than when you walk by a house and there's a great party going on. That's a field that, if you're a party goer, that attracts you. Or conversely, if you go into an office building, you open a conference room after there's been a very bad argument, and you open the door and you say, whoa, I don't want to go in here. That's a negative field. So these energy fields exist no matter whether we're conscious of them or not. If you can actually build a field, and what we did with the first 15 people, it built up to about 60 to 80 people meeting, and they attracted others. The mayor did not want to play with us. She thought it was not political. She thought it was a political liability. But 2 years later, she called up the client and said, we want to play. We understand what's going on. The president or the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce said he didn't need to talk to a couple of gringos from the States. And 10 months later, he calls up her client and he says, Ricardo, I don't know what you guys are doing, but count us in. This is the first time the city's been able to dream in 30 years. So this staying power, so by actually meeting every 6 weeks, working and having each individual interest area represented. We didn't ask for people to show up. They showed up on their own. So there were people involved with mobility and beach erosion and habitat connectivity and brownfield mitigation, gender equity, social divisions, they came around the table, and we had no interest in changing what they were focused on. What we were interested in is integrating them together so that they could actually support one another and learn from one another. And that took about 10 months before that started taking off. So the idea of regeneration, it's a continual practice, and it's to actually engage and sustain and evolve sustainability. And what does that require of us? Well, it actually asks us to do more than just build interesting buildings and green buildings, and these are tools, if you will, photovoltaic panels. It actually requires us to think about what does it mean to continually rebirth and rethink anew and evolve. Evolutionary health just doesn't happen. We need to be conscious of it. And buildings are actually, and big development projects are actually one of the more important leverage points we have in our culture. This project down in Viña del Mar is a 20 to 25-year project. Politicians don't last that long. NGOs typically don't last that long. But a big building project can actually sustain the momentum over time, as well as agriculture and as well as business. This is just another example. This just last month. This is a $4 billion project we're working on in Vancouver, and it's a wastewater treatment plant. So that's typically what people think about wastewater treatment plants, pure function. But the mandate from the director was to actually look at the health of the ecosystem. And even though the engineers are not very happy about that, we now have just got approved the 20 recommended ecological projects that will restore the health of the Fraser River, which is one of the great salmon rivers of the world, are actually being supported by Metro Vancouver. That never would have happened without thinking about this larger system that we are part of. And it took 2 years of continual engagement with the design team and the client team for the importance of that to be realized. So this is not doesn't happen instantly, folks. It's a practice. And any project, whether you're an accountant, a lawyer, an architect, a bus driver, doesn't matter, is that everything you're working on can actually be expanded. Actually, how do you in your work, how do you add value to that larger system? To be conscious of that is very important. And I'm going to skip that. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to go back to this. You can delete it if you want. One of the quick way to think about this is imagine designing or purchasing a home for your growing family. And what would you have to do to achieve this objective? Or designing a bedroom addition, what would you have to do? And many people say, well, you got to hire the architect or the builder, get financing, borrow the money, get the permits, maybe ask the children what they want. But here's a regenerative way of thinking about that. Imagine designing a bedroom addition for the purpose of developing your children. What's required of us to realize this? And you basically have to start exploring what capabilities required of me. What's our family? What system do we want to live within? Do we want to teach my children to be street smart or part of nature? That's how do we engage them with that larger system? What do we need to learn to do that? The first time I ever did this exercise, a guy stood up at the front of a room. There were 500 people in the room, and he said, "I realized I'm pretty screwed up." Everybody looked at him like they needed to leave the room. He was going to be kind of go nuts on them. And he said, "Stop it." He said, "Get over yourselves. We are all screwed up. We all have to work on ourselves. And if I'm going to be working on what's required of my children, I also need to be working on who I am and who I am with my wife." That's a pretty powerful lesson, I think, for all of us. So the takeaway actions for this. Your project is not the project. The project is the larger system. If we're actually going to get the massive change we need on the planet, we have to stop doing it project by project. We have to look at the people that are engaged in the project and how they can be inspired to change the world and work that they are engaged in. To do that, we actually need to understand the potential for health in each place. We need to think about adding value towards the health of that larger system. Not just about doing something inward. We have to continually think about outward. Then we integrate and engage stakeholders to serve and develop that larger potential. They know a lot more about it than you do. If we work together, we actually can accomplish so much more. Then all that work informs the project. And the last important idea is this is a practice. It takes 3 to 5 years of engagement to do it. And even working with in California right now, we're working with a large group in San Francisco who are working with an accessory dwelling units, small little structures. But but we're actually planning to work with all these builders and developers together to actually work on the health of the community. So there's always ways to engage this, even with small projects. And even now there's funds happening that are actually supporting this kind of work. So the world is changing. And I think I will not end very elegantly, except thank you for the time and for inviting me to do this. There are a couple of resource books, the Integrative Design Guide and Regenerative Development and Design. And I like to think about integrative design as the gateway drug, if you will, to regeneration. You've got to get people to work together before they actually think about as a way of actually supporting this larger system that we're part of. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.